The room is dim. The curtains are drawn, but thin cracks of daylight still force their way through, tracing lines across the walls like scars that refuse to fade. She sits on the edge of a plain mattress, her back slightly bent, her eyes open but fixed on nothing. Silence swells around her, the kind of silence that comes after storms, when the wreckage is complete and there is nothing left to break. Elizabeth Holmes, once the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world, once the golden child of Silicon Valley, hailed as a visionary who would change medicine forever. Today, she is something else entirely, an echo of ambition, a warning, a story whispered with both fascination and contempt. She is not the woman in the black turtleneck, not the oracle of health she once claimed to be. She is a human stripped bare by consequence, sitting in a rented room where shadows feel heavier than the walls themselves. But to understand this silence, this downfall, you must first return to the beginning, before the glory, before the lies, before the empire that turned to dust. Because every empire is built on a dream, and hers began with one simple, relentless obsession: to matter. She was born in Washington, D.C., into privilege, but not power. Her father worked in government agencies. Her mother was a congressional committee staffer. Comfortable, yes. Connected, perhaps, but not immortal. And Elizabeth was a child who could not stand the idea of fading into irrelevance. Even as a teenager, she carried herself differently, with an intensity that made others uneasy. She wanted not just to be smart, not just to succeed, she wanted to etch her name into history, to become untouchable, unforgettable. When she was still in high school, she filled notebooks with sketches of inventions, fragments of ideas. She studied Mandarin obsessively, convinced that fluency would be her edge in a world ruled by global markets. Her parents did not discourage her. They told her she could be great, that she could achieve anything. And Elizabeth, with her wide eyes and haunting conviction, believed so deeply that she refused to imagine a world where she was not extraordinary. At Stanford University, she arrived like a soldier reporting for battle. She enrolled in chemical engineering, gravitating toward the world of biotech. She was captivated by the promise of transforming the human body, of rewriting the limits of health. To her, medicine was not just a career path, it was a stage upon which she could finally perform her destiny. But lectures and labs were not enough. She was impatient, restless. Greatness, she believed, should not wait for graduation. So, at 19 years old, Elizabeth dropped out of Stanford. The decision startled her professors, but to her, it felt inevitable. She was convinced she had discovered the idea that would change the world. A device that could run hundreds of blood tests on just a single drop of blood. No more vials, no more needles, no more fear. A miracle, she called it. A revolution. The first domino of immortality. She called her company Theranos, a blend of therapy and diagnosis. The name itself was sleek, futuristic, designed to sound inevitable. And in the beginning, there was nothing, no product, no proof, only vision. But Elizabeth possessed something rarer than results. She possessed conviction so fierce it bent reality around her. She spoke with a low, steady voice, cultivating an aura of unshakable certainty. She dressed in black turtlenecks, mirroring Steve Jobs, wrapping herself in the costume of genius. Investors noticed. They always notice certainty. And she gave it to them in abundance. With piercing eyes and rehearsed silence, she made them believe. Believe in her vision, believe in her machine, believe in her destiny. Money poured in millions, then hundreds of millions. By her early 30s, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. And Elizabeth Holmes, who once feared irrelevance, became the youngest female billionaire on Earth. The world applauded. Politicians praised her. Business magazines worshipped her face on glossy covers. She was called the next Steve Jobs, the Edison of medicine, the savior of healthcare. She walked stages with presidents, posed with generals, advised the most powerful figures alive. Her company headquarters gleamed with glass walls and sharp angles, the architecture of inevitability. Inside, employees worked with hushed devotion, believing or pretending to believe in her dream. But behind the glass, something darker was unfolding. The machine, the miracle, the promise of hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood. It didn't work. It never worked the way she said it did. Engineers struggled. Scientists whispered doubts. Results were inconsistent, dangerous, often wrong. But Elizabeth refused hesitation. To her, doubt was betrayal. She silenced dissent. She installed secrecy, so suffocating that employees lived in fear. Non-disclosure agreements, threats of lawsuits, whispered conversations in parking lots. Her board of directors, stacked with names of power, but not science, asked few questions. The investors kept writing checks. And Elizabeth kept building the illusion. But illusions demand fuel. To keep her empire alive, she leaned on deception. Demonstrations for investors were carefully staged. Machines were swapped, results doctored, truths hidden behind locked doors. And when journalists began to sniff around, Elizabeth stood tall, her voice unwavering, her gaze unblinking. She told them the future was already here. She told them to believe, and for a time, the world did. Imagine her then, standing on the stage of a tech conference, the lights burning hot on her face, 1,000 eyes watching. She speaks slowly, every word deliberate, her black turtleneck absorbing the spotlight. She does not tremble. She does not blink. She radiates certainty, and certainty is contagious. The audience applauds, and she feels it surge through her veins, proof that she is not just a woman with an idea. She is history in motion, but in the shadows, the cracks widened. Whistleblowers stepped forward. Journalists dug deeper. The Wall Street Journal published an expose that tore through her empire like fire through dry grass. Suddenly, the applause quieted. The investors pulled back. Lawsuits began to circle. The myth of Theranos began to collapse, one revelation at a time. Still, Elizabeth clung to the image. She denied the allegations. She summoned her voice of conviction, as if sheer force could bend reality back into alignment. But this time, certainty was not enough. The truth was too heavy, too undeniable. Patients had been misdiagnosed. Lives had been risked. The dream that was supposed to save the world had, instead, endangered it. And the world turned on her. Magazines that once crowned her now stripped her titles. Politicians distanced themselves. Former allies spoke out, their admiration curdled into betrayal. The empire of glass and steel stood empty, its hallways echoing with absence. Elizabeth Holmes, who once strode among presidents, now found herself cornered by prosecutors and hounded by cameras. In 2018, Theranos dissolved. By 2022, she was on trial, charged with fraud. The girl who once dreamed of immortality now faced years behind bars. And so we return to this room, this silence. Elizabeth sits alone, the empire gone, the voices of power faded into memory. She remembers the stages, the applause, the belief. She remembers how it felt to stand at the center of history. And she remembers the lies, the pressure, the choices that could not be undone. Outside, the world debates her name. To some, she is a monster, a manipulator, a fraud who gambled with lives. To others, she is a tragic figure, consumed by ambition in a world that rewards illusions until they collapse. But to Elizabeth herself, in this silence, the labels do not matter. She is left with only the truth she cannot escape. She wanted to change the world, and instead, she destroyed her own. The silence of the present is pierced by memory. because Elizabeth cannot help but return to it the fevered days when ambition consumed her like fire, when every morning felt like destiny was calling her name. She remembers the thrill of control, of being the center of a storm she had created, and the terror of knowing, deep inside, that the storm was not sustainable. There is a particular night she replays often. The Theranos building glowed against the Palo Alto sky, its glass walls a mirror of her vision. Inside, the machines hummed, not with triumph, but with frustration. Engineers stayed late, whispering anxiously over failed results. Elizabeth walked the corridors, her footsteps sharp against polished floors, her eyes scanning everything with unnatural stillness. She projected calm, but inside she was unraveling. She knew the technology wasn't ready. She knew the promise was ahead of the science. And yet she whispered to herself, again and again, they must not doubt me. If they doubt me, it is over. In those days, she practiced silence as a weapon. When confronted with questions she could not answer, she let the pause stretch long, too long, until the questioner bent under the weight of it. When investors pressed for proof, she stared at them, unblinking, until their confidence broke before hers. To them, she seemed like a prophet. To herself, she was already a ghost, terrified of being seen through. But ambition is louder than fear. Every accolade fed her hunger. Every headline became oxygen. She read the glowing articles about herself and fortune, in Forbes, in Time, and she believed them, even as her own employees began to doubt. She cultivated not just an image but a mythology. The young woman who defied a world of men, who built an empire out of nothing but vision. It was intoxicating, and it was fragile. And then came the unraveling. When the truth emerged, it was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, suffocating squeeze. First, whispers in the press. Then questions from regulators. Then subpoenas, lawsuits, the kind of pressure that no silence could withstand. Elizabeth stood before cameras, insisting the dream was real, even as the walls fell in around her. She wore the same turtlenecks, the same steady expression, but the conviction in her eyes was no longer unshakable. It was brittle, desperate. She remembers the trial, the courtroom air heavy, the world watching. Former employees testified, their words slicing away at the myth she had built. They spoke of intimidation, of secrecy, of results altered and truth buried. And Elizabeth, sitting at the defense table, tried to keep her mask intact. But inside, she felt exposed, naked in a way she had never imagined. Every ambition, every manipulation, every carefully curated silence was dragged into the light. The verdict came like a sentence, not just on her actions, but on her very essence. Guilty of fraud. The empire was not merely gone, it was declared an illusion from the beginning. And with that verdict, Elizabeth Holmes ceased to be a visionary. She became a cautionary tale. Now, stripped of power, her days move slowly, measured not by grand announcements or magazine covers, but by the dull passage of time. She wakes without applause. She eats without assistance. She walks streets where no one asks for her photograph. In the quiet, she confronts questions she can no longer silence. Who was she really? A dreamer betrayed by her own vision, or a liar who built her fortune on deception? The truth, perhaps, is both, because ambition is a dangerous thing. It begins as hope, as the light of possibility, and it burns. It burns until it consumes caution, consumes patience, consumes morality. Elizabeth wanted to matter, and she did. For a brief, blinding moment, she mattered more than almost anyone alive. And then, like fire denied oxygen, her empire collapsed, leaving only smoke and ash. She thinks of the people who trusted her, the investors who lost fortunes, the employees who sacrificed their careers, the patients who received false results, some reassured when they should have been warned, some terrified when they were healthy. She wonders if they think of her still, if they remember the unshakable voice that once convinced them of miracles. She wonders if they hate her, or if they pity her. Sometimes, in the silence, Elizabeth imagines another life. A life where she admitted failure early, where she slowed down, where she built something real, brick by brick instead of illusion by illusion. A life where she let herself be human instead of a prophet. In that imagined life, she is not infamous. She is simply a scientist, working quietly, building slowly. But imagination cannot undo reality. Reality is the mattress she sits on, the absence of silk sheets, the absence of applause. Reality is the knowledge that she will never again walk on stage to a standing ovation. Reality is the cold truth that history will not remember her as Edison or Jobs or any savior of medicine. History will remember her as a warning, and yet there is still breath in her lungs. There is still time, even if it is not the time she once dreamed of. Perhaps in the silence, there is space for reflection, for some kind of redemption, not through glory, but through humility. Elizabeth Holmes will never rebuild Theranos, never stand at the center of the world again. But maybe she can learn to live not as a myth, not as an empire, but as a person. That is the cruelest and truest ending of all. Not death, not eternal disgrace, but the slow work of living with consequence. Of waking each day in the wreckage and finding, somehow, a way to breathe. Because Elizabeth Holmes once believed she would change the world. And in a way, she did. But not as a savior, not as a pioneer. She changed the world as a reminder. A reminder of what happens when ambition outpaces truth. When the hunger to matter becomes louder than the responsibility to be honest. Her story is not one of triumph, nor even of tragedy. It is the story of a rise built on illusion, and of a fall that revealed the cost. And it is a story that does not end with redemption or applause, but with silence, a silence she must carry for the rest of her life. And so, the woman who once dreamed of immortality now wakes each morning with nothing more than herself. And maybe that is punishment enough.